Hello and welcome to Foreign Dispatches, the program that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Shoboale. On the program this week, Myanmar's military seizes power in a coup against the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi, plus Russian activist Alexey Navalny sentenced to prison despite widespread protests. Days after Myanmar's military staged a bloodless coup, normal life has resumed as local residents go about their daily lives. But for many unhappy about the military action, there are mounting doubts about the future of the Southeast Asian nation faced with economic struggles and the COVID-19 pandemic.
The din of banging pots and honking car horns reverberated through Myanmar's biggest city of Yangon late on Tuesday in the first widespread protest against the military coup that overthrew elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. The army claims it acted in response to election fraud, handing power to military chief Min Aung Hlaing and imposing a state of emergency for 1 year. Phone and internet connections in the capital, Naypyidaw, and the main commercial center of Yangon were cut off, and state TV went off-air hours before Parliament had been due to sit for the first time since the National League for Democracy's party's landslide election win in November. Following news of a coup, swaggering supporters of Myanmar's army chief swung through the streets of Yangon, waving national flags from pickup trucks to cheer on his coup. But for many others, they felt the country's hard-fought battle for democracy had been lost.
As citizens, we want a leader of our own choice, chosen freely. The action of arresting the leader is not a thing to be accepted, because we have gone through year after year to elect these leaders who can really lead the country's changes and improve the country after systematic voting. We can't accept the illegal seizure of power to take control and use of these intense actions.
Western leaders have condemned the coup, and US President Joe Biden has threatened to reimpose sanctions on Myanmar.
As President Biden and Secretary Blinken have said, the United States is deeply concerned by the Burmese military's detention of civilian government leaders, including State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi and civil society leaders. After a review of all the facts, we have assessed that the Burmese military's actions on February 1st, having deposed the duly elected head of government, constituted a military coup d'etat. The United States will continue to work closely with our partners throughout the region and the world to support respect for democracy and the rule of law in Burma, as well as to promote accountability for those responsible for overturning Burma's democratic transition.
Myanmar, also known as Burma, was ruled by the armed forces until 2011, when democratic reforms led by Aung San Suu Kyi ended military rule. She spent nearly 15 years in detention between 1989 and 2010. She was internationally hailed as a beacon of democracy and received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. But her international reputation suffered severely following an army crackdown on the mostly Muslim Rohingya minority. Former supporters accused her of refusing to condemn the military or acknowledge accounts of atrocities.
Myanmar's neighbors in Southeast Asia have expressed serious concern over the military takeover in the country. In Thailand, protesters took to the streets to voice their concerns, calling on the international community to intervene.
Dressed in red, the signature color of Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, protesters in Bangkok hoisted posters of the army chief, pasted with the words, "Shame on you, dictator."
I'm so worried because the military have guns in their hands. They never give people the true democracy. All they want is power. They never think about the people. Everyone knows how our country has been underdeveloped because of military rule. I'm begging the world to pressure the Myanmar military to return the power to the people. Please help us.
Thailand's Prime Minister Prayut Chan-ocha, a former army chief who seized power in a coup in 2014, says the matter is an internal affair and warned the media on Tuesday not to stoke conflict with reporting on Myanmar's coup.
I want all media to be careful about reporting. I don't want you to harm our neighbors' economic and social interests. This is also a matter for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I don't want you to expand the conflict.
Earlier, heavily armed police in Thailand's capital clashed with a group of demonstrators. At least 2 people were injured at the protest, which took place outside Myanmar's embassy in Bangkok, where at least 200 people had gathered, including Thai and Myanmar citizens. The military takeover in Myanmar followed days of escalating tensions between the military and the government after the November 2020 elections, which was won by Aung San Suu Kyi's party, National League for Democracy. The polls were only the second democratic elections in Myanmar since the end of nearly 5 decades of military rule. The first elections in 2015 were also won by NDL.
Hundreds of protesters also gathered in Japan this week to protest the detention of Myanmar's leaders. Demonstrators stood outside the United Nations University in downtown Tokyo and called on the international body to further condemn the military's actions.
A group of Myanmar nationals held a protest calling for international support in front of the United Nations University in Tokyo on February 1st, the day of the military coup. According to officials, around 700 people participated in the demonstrations. Protesters raised pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi and demanded that the United Nations and other parties approach the armed forces to push for the release of their leader.
I hope the Japanese government can put as much pressure as possible on Myanmar's military. We cannot achieve this with just the power of the Myanmar people. Japan is strong, so we would like to ask the Japanese government to help us.
First, we would like to ask the Japanese government not to recognize the military government. This is one of our petitions. Second, we ask the Japanese government to put pressure on Myanmar's military to release the leaders who were detained in Myanmar immediately.
Japan and Myanmar have long had close ties, with Tokyo a major aid donor over the years and scores of firms engaged in business activities there. There were around 33,000 Burmese living in Japan as of June last year, with almost half of them on technical trainee visas, which allows them to work in Japan. The Japanese government has called on Myanmar on Monday to release leaders arrested after the military seized power, adding that it supported democracy in the nation and demanded it be promptly restored.
Amidst all this, there are concerns over the situation of the minority Rohingya community, who in the past have faced violent persecution by Myanmar's military. The military takeover has raised fears in neighboring Bangladesh that the new regime may not honor commitments to repatriate about 1 million refugees currently in the country.
Cox's Bazar in sovereign Bangladesh is home to more than 1 million Muslim Rohingya living in cramped, makeshift camps, the world's largest refugee settlement after they fled what the United Nations has termed a genocide in Myanmar's Rakhine state in 2017. Myanmar said it was committed to the repatriation of the Rohingya as per a bilateral agreement, with Bangladesh expecting the process to start later this year. Last month, Dhaka started relocating some of the refugees to Bhasan Char, an isolated island in the Bay of Bengal. So far, nearly 7,000 Rohingya have been sent to the flood-prone island.
3 years we have been in Bangladesh now. We want to go back to our home, but we can't. There are no words to describe how much we miss our home. We want to go back home.
The coup has disquieted Bangladesh, which fears the new military government might not keep up its end of the agreements to repatriate more of the Rohingya. The neighbors had been at odds in the past few years over the repeatedly stalled repatriation process.
There is no record of the Myanmar military looking after the well-being of Rohingya people. We were also ill-treated by the NLD government. I'm worried that our repatriation will be delayed because of this coup.
And for the about 600,000 Rohingya Muslims still in Myanmar, the United Nations fears the coup will worsen their plight.
There are about 600,000 Rohingyas that remain in Rakhine State, including 120,000 people who are, effectively confined to camps. They cannot move freely and have extremely limited access to basic health and educational services. So our fear is that the events may make the situation worse.
The Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar has urged the international community to show resolve in denouncing the military's actions.
Now, the military, the generals have often said that they are impervious to international pressure. It just doesn't matter what the international community does. It's going to do whatever it wants to do. And of course, they're used to not being held accountable by anybody. But what is clear is that this illegal activity, this outrageous assault on the people of Myanmar by the military cannot be allowed to stand.
Rohingyas endured decades of abuse in Myanmar, beginning in the 1970s when hundreds of thousands sought refuge in Bangladesh. The latest Rohingya exodus to Bangladesh resumed in August 2017, following a military crackdown on the ethnic minority group. Several attempts at repatriation under a joint agreement failed because the Rohingya refused to go, fearing more violence in a country that denies them basic rights, including citizenship.
Away from the situation in Myanmar and to Russia, where Alexey Navalny, one of President Vladimir Putin's prominent critic, has been sentenced to prison for 3.5 years over an alleged parole violation. Navalny has been arrested and detained several times, but had until now avoided lengthy sentences.
A Moscow court on Tuesday ordered Russian opposition leader Alexey Navalny to prison for 3.5 years for violating the terms of his probation. With time he has previously served under house arrest, it will leave Navalny to serve just over 2.5 years in prison to finish the sentence. Standing in the defendant's box, Navalny stayed relatively still throughout the lengthy court proceedings. He took his hands from his pocket on one occasion, however, to outline a heart and a glass as a message to his wife. The ruling came despite massive protests across Russia over the past 2 weekends and Western calls to free the 44-year-old anti-corruption campaigner. The prison sentence stems from a 2014 embezzlement conviction. Just before the ruling, Navalny had denounced the proceedings as a vain attempt by the Kremlin to scare millions of Russians into submission. His lawyers say they will appeal the judgment. Navalny was arrested on January 17th as he arrived home in Russia, having spent 5 months in Germany recovering from being poisoned by the Novichok nerve agent. The Kremlin critic maintains it was an attack authorized by the Russian president himself, whereas Russian authorities altogether deny the claim, and they say there is no proof a poisoning took place. This is despite European lab tests finding otherwise. The Russian government has accused Western countries of stoking the unrest, saying the presence of foreign diplomats at Navalny's court hearing was proof of the West's attempt to deter Russia.
After the court ruling, people started gathering in central Moscow despite heavy police presence after Navalny's team called on his supporters to come out in protest of the decision. More than 1,000 people were arrested across the country in the course of the day.
Hundreds of protesters gathered in central Moscow after the court's decision to jail Alexey Navalny. Soon there were violent scenes in the capital as protesters clashed with police.
I don't want my children to grow up in the same conditions as I did. I tried to do something at least, and look what happened to him.
Russia's OVD Info Human Rights Monitor said 1,116 people were detained on Tuesday in Moscow and 246 in St. Petersburg, the country's second largest city. Another 15 people were held in smaller Russian cities. Navalny's jailing has triggered massive protests across Russia for the past 2 weekends, with tens of thousands taken to the streets to demand his release and chant slogans against Putin. Last weekend, police detained more than 5,750 people, including more than 1,900 in Moscow, the biggest number the country has seen since Soviet times.
South Africa has received its first coronavirus vaccine doses, offering some relief to health workers who have been stretched by a second wave of infections and who are first in line for the shots. Our South Africa Bureau Chief, Betty Dibia, tells us more.
This Monday, the expected 1 million doses of the Covishield vaccine arrived via an Emirates flight from India, and President Cyril Ramaphosa, his deputy David Mabuza, Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize, among other dignitaries, defied the rain to receive the precious cargo. Now the first batch of vaccines is here, the President told the nation later that day the hows and whens.
Now that the vaccines have arrived, they will be tested at the National Control Laboratory to confirm that their integrity has been maintained during transportation from India to South Africa. After testing, they'll be distributed across the country to thousands of our health workers in accordance with our phased rollout strategy. All healthcare workers in the public and private sectors will be prioritized for vaccination. Provincial health departments have submitted their distribution plans, and we have identified about 200 facilities throughout the country to which the vaccines can be distributed. Once we have completed the vaccination of health workers, we will move to phase 2 of the National Vaccine Strategy, which will include essential workers, people over 60 years, people with comorbidities, in other words, other health challenges, as well as those living in places such as nursing homes and hostels. In phase 3, we will extend the vaccination program to the rest of the adult population.
The President also says there is more to come.
We are in advanced negotiations with manufacturers to secure additional supplies. South Africa will also receive an allocation of vaccine doses through the African Union, which has been negotiating with manufacturers to secure vaccines for the entire continent on a pooled basis.
While the vaccines go through the various quality checks in the next 2 weeks, the provinces are gearing up to receive their own allocations. First to receive the vaccines, according to the National Rollout Plan, are the healthcare workers. This Wednesday, the Health Minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, launched the Electronic Vaccine Data System, a self-enrollment portal to pre-register for a jab.
Nor will the vaccine
President Ramaphosa announced that no one will be forced to be vaccinated, and all willing adults, including undocumented immigrants, can sign up to be vaccinated. We asked some people on the streets if they would get the shot.
Some point or the other, I think whether we like it or not, like with the flu vaccine, the majority of the population are going to have to take it. Me, myself, I think like with most computer software programs, the first vaccine that comes out, I don't think I'll take the first vaccine, and I'll wait for other variants of the vaccine to come out before I take it.
Oh yeah, I have no problems with the vaccination.
In terms of the safety and efficacy and all of that, I'm very comfortable. I'll definitely get vaccinated as soon as possible because it would help me get back to a more normal life.
According to experts, each pack contains 50 vials of the Covishield vaccine, enough to vaccinate 9 to 10 people, and has to be used within 6 hours. South Africa's goal is to vaccinate up to 67% of the population in the next 12 months. This translates to about 42 million people in a 3-phase vaccine rollout. Alongside this effort are planned intensive enlightenment programs as well as sustained appeals for adherence to health safety regulations, because even though the second wave of COVID-19 may have passed and recovery rate improving, the numbers are still relatively high. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia for Foreign Dispatches.
While vaccinations against the coronavirus gather pace in other parts of Europe, doctors in Ukraine are still waiting. Ukraine's failure to make progress on the vaccine front has become increasingly alarming over the past few months. The country had concluded zero supply contracts by the start of 2021 and is now scrambling to secure vaccine doses for its population.
In Kyiv City Hospital's COVID-19 emergency ward, 3 patients lie quietly on beds, breathing through ventilators. One has a portrait of himself drawn by his grandson, pasted above his bed as a get well soon message. Half of the department's staff have been infected at some point, and there are still personnel shortages.
I don't know all the details about the negotiations and all vaccine procurement procedures, but I can say as a simple doctor and as a Ukrainian citizen that I don't think that Ukraine did a great job. Why? Because many countries and our neighbors between them already have the vaccine and have started vaccinations, but we haven't.
One of Europe's poorest countries, Ukraine has found itself at the back of the continent's vaccine queue, slower to procure them independently, unwilling to buy from Russia, while publicly cajoling the EU for supplies for its 41 million people.
We were asking the European Union several times to give Ukraine a certain quota of the vaccine. We didn't ask them to give it to us for free. We were ready to pay the same price as other European countries. Moreover, we were ready to pay even more to save the lives of Ukrainian citizens.
With relations between Kyiv and Moscow toxic after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine banned the use of Russian COVID vaccines. President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed to the leaders of EU countries for help. Meanwhile, the EU, who's embroiled in its own problems to secure supplies, says it is willing to help, which it has done so far by funding the global COVAX scheme, supplying COVID vaccines to poorer countries, including Ukraine. Ukraine plans to vaccinate 14.4 million people this year, starting from this month, when it expects 117,000 Pfizer-BioNTech doses through COVAX. It will also procure Chinese vaccines despite concerns about their efficacy. But progress could be slow. Reports by the Economist Intelligence Unit says Ukraine and neighboring Moldova are the only countries in Europe likely to reach widespread COVID vaccinations only by 2023. The government and Ukraine's independent medical procurement agency have traded blame over the speed of the rollout.
And some positive news to wrap up the program now. Rome's iconic Colosseum has opened its doors to the public once again, as most of Italy enters a yellow zone, easing coronavirus restrictions. To mark the special occasion, visitors were treated to beautiful music at the historic venue.
The sounds of classical music echoes around an almost empty Colosseum as a concert takes place as organizers hope for a new beginning. COVID-19 restrictions were relaxed in Rome for the first time since before Christmas, on Monday allowing the Colosseum and other museums to open. But there were no crowds and hordes of people waiting to get in. Only a few people had the privilege of listening to the concert in an almost empty arena.
I was so happy. Yeah, for the first time there is something positive in COVID. Now I went to the Vatican now, and I saw the Capella Sixtina alone. And so I want to see this alone also. No, this is fantastic.
Students from the Santa Cecilia Conservatory played a classical selection inside the Colosseum for the special occasion. It was particularly special for the performers who have not had an opportunity to perform live for members of the public due to COVID restrictions.
It's very emotional because there haven't been many concerts during this time. So to be here on the first day of the reopening, it's a pleasure.
As one of the most iconic Italian monuments, the Colosseum witnessed many historic events in human history. Built by the Roman Emperor Vespasian, the amphitheater could seat 50,000 spectators who would gather to watch gladiatorial contests and sometimes executions.
And now this is where we say goodbye till next week. But remember that you can catch up with all our top stories on channelstv.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Tenyola Shoboale. Stay safe.